Welcome to the short session that I'll be giving. 20 minutes. We are talking about Bambleweeny. And if you don't know what that is, you're probably in good company. It's a new project. You'll hear all about it. A few things about myself. I'm a developer advocate at Axway, focusing on API, automation, containers, Python, a lot of HTTP stuff. You'll find me on LinkedIn. A lot of things that I do, I post on LinkedIn, I blog, I write. And many of my projects and also the slides that you see today are already on my GitHub. So if you just remember my handle, it's U1I. You'll find both the project that we'll be discussing today, as well as the slides and many other fun things, I hope, on my repository. Awesome. I always like it when people take photos of my slides. Okay, you can probably tell from the looks I'm from Singapore. Laughs are helping us to stay awake. Singapore is a very small red dot in Southeast Asia. It's a very busy island, and there is a lot of people and a lot of interesting things happening over there. If you haven't been there yet, I encourage you to visit one day. I run the Redis Meetup and user group in Singapore as well. We are always looking for speakers. If you are in the neighborhood, if you're keen to speak, just keep it in the back of your mind. Reach out if you're there. Asia is super exciting and lots of cool stuff is coming out of there. Okay, quick agenda. We will talk about Bambleweeny. What does it do? We'll talk about some of the use cases and how you can get involved, because that's the purpose of the talk mostly. Okay. Anybody read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Right, a few hands. Of course, it's part of the improbability generator, right? I'm a huge fan. I also run a meetup in Singapore, which is called Mostly Harmless, which is more like a Dead Poet Society, where we talk about the way technology changes the way we live our lives. I basically chose the name for the project to make sure people don't confuse it with a production-grade system, because it's not what it's supposed to be about, right? A few points. So, in essence, we all know Redis, and even if you don't know Redis really well, it's great. For this project, you don't have to, right? So it's a lightweight HTTP-based key value store and message broker. In essence, if you know Redis, it gives you lists and keys over HTTP and puts an OAuth authentication mechanism in front of it, which basically gives you multi-tenancy. You can do access control quotas. It's really fast, not as fast as Redis, we'll get to that. Easy to use, and there is lots of documentation and clients that are available. I wrote this in Python. It has Redis in it, if you like, and it deploys in a 23 megabyte container that's on Docker Hub. There is a really nice busy diagram on the side. We'll get to that in a moment. You know, I sit a lot at conferences like this, and sometimes I wish, is there an easier way to say this, right? And then basically earlier today I just put in these two slides. Well, we all know if we're dealing with Redis, right? I have a client, can be a command line interface, it can be anything basically, and I interact with the thing over a specific TCP port, which is awesome, right? I work with a lot of clients in heavily regulated industries, governments, FSI, right? Where we all know who work in that space, even having an HTTP connection is sometimes difficult, but at least in most cases we have that, right? Over a proxy. And that's basically the principal motivation. So the idea is that we have a functionality similar to Redis, not all of it, the core functionality, available over HTTP. Right? And you see that I've pretty much like Kubernetes, I've changed Bambleweeny into B9Y, which you also see on the documentation and the SDK. Right? The second slide, now that we are having an idea what Bambleweeny does, there is two ways of consumption, right? Either you say, I want to use that self-contained piece. It comes with a small Redis module embedded, so you don't have to spin it up elsewhere. And the second mode is to say, well, in fact, I just want to put an HTTP API interface in front of an existing Redis instance or cluster. You use it for that one, right? Okay, which brings us to that busy diagram. So in essence, you see that box in the middle. You see that there's keys and there's lists, the concept that we know from a Redis practice. There is an OAuth server. Who's worked with APIs, bearer tokens before? There is a very good share, fantastic. So there is an OAuth server implementation in the module as well, which exposes an HTTP interface. And basically any client interface, a browser, a mobile phone, Postman, right, consumes it. Even the command line interface consumes the REST API to interface with the keys and with the lists. Now, we use Bambleweeny a lot for proof of concepts, and we'll get to the use cases later. And we also realized that's all awesome, but in certain use cases, we just want to have a quick HTTP server for specific objects, to mock APIs, for example. That's why we built the routes, right? Routes allow you to expose a certain key over HTTP, and you specify the content type, and there is no authentication needed, and you can retrieve that object. The second ones are the bins, right? So imagine that you have clients that produce data, and you just want to post them somewhere without authentication. That's where you use the bins for. I'll show you detailed examples later, right? It's all API-based, which is what we want to talk about, right? So when I built that project, I think pretty much September, October last year, before writing any piece of code, I started using Swagger, right? And using Postman to define the contract, to define the interface. You see that on my T-shirt? API first, right? Design the contract first. What do I get? How do I use it? What are the endpoints? What's the security model, right? How do I authenticate? Before you write any piece of code, you start with this. So for those who have seen APIs before, all those colors and the create, read, update, delete, list interface is pretty familiar, right? To everybody else, if you've browsed the web, if you know how the URL schemes in Wikipedia works, right, where you have slashes, it's the same model. So, example, right? In 20 minutes, I can't give you a live demo, so I've captured the things in relevant screenshots, so we have time to focus on the entire story. So if you fire up Postman, and you see that in this case, Bambleweeny is running on localhost, port 8080, /keys/RedisConf gives you hello world. Simple example. I'm a Python guy. Anybody who wants to use Bambleweeny, it's irrelevant what your language is, since we are talking HTTP REST. Right? The moment you can consume Swagger, the moment you can trigger HTTP calls and consume the response, it's all good. We've also built a Python client library, right? So you can have a client that uses HTTP to connect with that database, if you want to call it this way, out of Python. We built a command line interface which runs on Windows, on Mac, on Linux, which will probably very much remind you of the Redis command line interface. And some of the commands are very, very similar. Again, you are getting my theme. The only difference is there is HTTP between those things. That means my Bambleweeny instance at home runs on a Raspberry Pi, and I use ngrok to expose it to the net, and I use a specific authentication string to connect with it on the command line, and I can manipulate keys in the database. Okay. Again, we're not doing a live demo, but a very simple way to provision Bambleweeny is to do this docker run command. Of course, you will probably choose another port, but that is all that you need. The moment you have Docker anywhere, you can run it. Right? Docker run daemon, choose a random port. This is the container on Docker Hub. I mentioned earlier there is multiple configuration options. So you will say, you know what, actually I have a Redis instance already. In fact, I have a Redis cluster in front of AWS, Azure, GCP, and I want to expose certain parts over HTTP. You just put it in front of it. It works on Kubernetes. It works on OpenShift. It's something that is very easy to install and get running because that's the theme of our story. Right. Almost everybody, I hope, uses curl for some of the tricky bits. GUIs always lie to you. The command line tells the truth. Very simple example, curl. And let's just assume that we have a host entry, B9Y, that points to Bambleweeny on port 80. /keys/foo. We'll talk about authentication in a moment. For me, the key point is that we talk about the interface, right? So I'm getting foo, I'm getting bar. The interesting difference is, of course, that depending on my authentication token, my response might be different. Because again, as I explained earlier, it's a multi-tenancy. The keys are private to the user, right? So the same URL could produce different results to different users. Okay, a set request. Let's say we want to change foo to something else. In this case, we want to change it to bar, right? So we are doing a put request. The data, the raw data is bar. And you specify the key that you want to put this in. And you'll see the info is OK. And you can even do this with binary files. So you can post images there as well. OK, this gets a little more tricky. But in essence, this is what I mentioned earlier, right? We realized with lists and keys, we can get really, really far. We can do a bit of distributed coordination. We can mock a couple of backends. We can mock API endpoints. But there are certain scenarios where we really just want to retrieve a certain object in a browser session with JavaScript. Or we want to have some code that pushes data somewhere and the queue picks it up. Message broker, right? So in this case, what we are looking to do is say, OK, you've seen, and in this case, I'm using the command line interface, by the way. So you see here, I'm setting the content type to text plain, right? So in the previous example, we set foo to bar. That key is already there in the database. The next step is to say, well, to access this one, I need to be authenticated. But in this case, we want to expose it. So that's where the routes come in. We'll say the key, foo, we want to expose as content type text plain. And we want to create a route. So the response that you see in gray, routes, and then that complicated key name is the response. And basically, any unauthenticated HTTP request to this route will give you the key. And it's I'm not showing this to you in an example, but the same is true for the bins, right? Where you can expose a list as a bin, and everybody who's doing a post request to that specific HTTP URL, it will get added to that list in Redis. Which brings us to the authentication, right? So I've showed you these examples. You see that we have keys and lists, right? And just like in Redis, you need to be authenticated in order to manipulate those, or even to retrieve those. At the same time, above the iceberg, we decided we need to have certain unauthenticated access models for bins, and in the example that I just showed you for routes, right? Key and lists are private. For those who work with APIs, so basically the first request that you do to Bambleweeny is that you go to /auth/token with username, password, credentials, and you receive a JWT token that expires after a configurable timeout. And all the subsequent requests that you do to Bambleweeny use that bearer token as an authentication mechanism. And that helps us to save quite a bit of time. Now, why are we doing this? I mentioned some of this in my earlier comments, right? Redis is very extremely fast. When I do, and I picked a T2 micro on AWS. If I do a speed comparison, you see that Redis is about 100 times faster, right? That's quite a number. So back to my original story, Bambleweeny is not a production-grade environment, and I need to convince some of my customers who are already using it not to use it in a production environment, because it's so easy to use that they've just went ahead in certain ways. So why are we doing this, right? It's meant for prototyping. It's meant for proof of concepts, to get things going very quickly. You've seen some of the keynotes this morning. I also enjoy going to meetups, and there is a lot of science fiction in these stories, right? Many of them involve setting up a gigantic infrastructure, which comes with operational expenses and a long time that we need to get going. In many cases, like the scenarios that I described earlier, quick proof of concepts, a hackathon, a prototype for an app, for a distributed system, we don't have that, right? And it doesn't mean we don't need those. We will need those eventually, the moment we scale, the moment things mature, right? But for something that I want to hack in an hour or in an afternoon to convince my stakeholder to say, this is the way to go, this is what we want to build, and look at this, it works already, it makes no difference, right? And 400 requests, 500 requests per second for a small machine is actually quite a good number when we're talking about an early prototype, right? So that's the level setting that we want, right? Which brings me to one of these examples, right? We've started to sketch out a prototype for a kiosk system called Kaleidoscope, right? So imagine that everybody in front of you has a laptop, and they'll open a specific website, and with one API call, I can change the content of each one of your laptops, right? To say, I want you to see this markdown file, this video on autoplay, this image, right? So you can use it for, well, let's say operations. You have these large monitors in the operations room, and you can enable your backend systems, monitoring, Nagios, whatever you use, to send data that's displayed on these big monitors. One example. And the other one, this is what I mentioned earlier. So there is actually quite a bit of functionality in Bambleweeny already that I can't pack into 20 minutes. But something really interesting is the nested keys, which are dynamically passed. So I use it a lot to mock APIs, mock API endpoints. So in this case, I'm actually using the command line interface, not curl. You see that in the first command, I say, well, set API to message. And you see that the actual message is a little cryptic. There is a bang, ampersand, and those weird brackets, which actually means the moment somebody retrieves that key, please parse it and put the current status of message in there. So in the second command, I'll actually set message to cool stuff. And I mentioned that earlier already. I create a route to the key API, which gives me one of those cryptic URLs again. And I say, by the way, anybody accessing that route, please serve it as application JSON and as UTF-8. And the moment somebody triggers a curl request, an HTTP request on this URL, they'll see message cool stuff as content type application JSON. And the moment I go to the command line or trigger an API call or whatever actually, and change the message, the same request will produce a different result. Right? So back to the idea of mocking, prototyping, proof of concepts, quick wins, because that's ultimately the idea that Bambleweeny was conceived for. Which brings me to the last slide. Yeah, the idea is to find out who is actually responsible for these 1,500 Docker pulls that I'm seeing on my Docker Hub, right? 1,500 people downloaded it. I wished I knew more about these people, right? So we've already opened a few tickets for something that could be improved, that could be added to the functionality. I'd like you to try it out because I actually think it's very easy to use, and you'll be able to bring that to your internal audience, to your internal customers who build prototypes, who do hackathons, to get something standing up really quickly. Ideally, help me make it better. And it doesn't mean you have to be a Python coder. If you just test it and say, you know what, that doesn't work, or that could be improved, or the documentation isn't really up to date, or let's translate the documentation in Klingon because, yeah, that helps, right? Because ultimately, we want to spread the word. We want to create a community. We want to have our own project that deserves its place in our working environment. And that's it for me. I hope you have questions when we end the presentation. Thank you very much.
Any questions, guys?
Do you know why Redis doesn't have anything beyond that single? Do you know why? I've wondered for a while why Redis doesn't have stronger authentication, so that there isn't a besides just a single password authentication.
Yeah.
And I was interested what led you down this path, because I've thought about this, open auth and so forth.
Yeah, well, I was excited last night when I spoke to our keynote presenter who was having the session this morning here, who presented the ACLs, right, which are going in the same direction, which is exciting because that's the same idea. We want to create some sort of multi-tenancy without, not at the cost of performance, right? Why didn't it have that before? I really like the idea of keeping something really distinct, and again, performance and ease of use and feature richness sometimes don't always go together. So I miss that part because I see it a lot in, specifically as we talk about, we want to take Redis in this case to a world where people don't trust each other, right? Redis simple authentication is used among friends, right? Inside the same cluster, for example, right? And in this HTTP space, we can talk about all possible devices. Right. So
this is not efficient enough for taking it into places where it's not friendly.
Yeah.
You still want the efficiency.
Yeah.
So that's an ongoing question.
Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
One last question. Anybody else?
Thanks a lot.